Thank you. Hello, I am Jennifer Byrne, and welcome to an evening with the frolicsome and fabulous Stephen Fry. It's going to be a special night because following Stephen's solo entertainment, when he will, I imagine, be using both of his two brains, he'll be joining me on stage for a conversation, which promises to be quite interesting also. So let me introduce a true international treasure, a man who has the Renaissance mind combined with a ferocious command and control of modern media. Please welcome writer, raconteur, author. How do you begin to describe the one and only Mr. Stephen Fry?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Oh, my word. Oh, good heavens. Thank you. Thank you. Holy crap! Thank you so much. Oh, stop. Ladies and gentlemen, behave yourselves. Thank you very much. Oh, my word. Oh, my goodness. Whoa. Stop. Oh, stop. Oh, you have. Never mind. Oh, my goodness. Ladies and gentlemen, I can't find the words to welcome you to this extraordinary evening. It's extraordinary in my life. It may be extraordinary in your life, but maybe you have performed in front of 2,500 people before. I certainly haven't. It's an unbelievable pleasure to be here. It's very hard to know quite where to begin. I'm not a stand-up comedian. I don't have an act as such. So I thought we would experiment this evening. There are people all around me. Have you noticed that? It's quite marvelous. I was assured, ladies and gentlemen, Poverty Row! How wonderful. I've got 45 minutes, roughly, in which to speak to you on my own, and I have so many things to say. I'm likely to overrun because I'm such a garrulous person. I have logorrhea, and I'm going to choose somebody from Poverty Row, who's rather bold. One of you? I'm going to take someone in the front row. What's your name?
It's Esther.
Esther. This is Esther, ladies and gentlemen. Have you got a watch? You've got the phone? All right, okay. Making sure that it's on airplane mode. Go to the clock, right? Utility. She's got to turn it. She's turned it off. Her job, Esther's job, is to tell me when 45 minutes are up, because I'll get lost. I will be inebriated with the exuberance of my own verbosity. Thank you. You're on it. 45 minutes. Go, obviously if I'm in the middle of a joke, if I'm perched on the edge of a punchline, shut the fuck up, all right? But otherwise we're happy. Now, this is so exciting. This is a remarkable moment for me. I've really never done anything like this before. I've done talks to small numbers of people, and I've done the odd reading, but to try and keep 2,500 Sydney-siders happy is jolly difficult, because you have a reputation in Sydney. You probably aren't aware of this, but I was speaking to someone from Melbourne the other day. You're all wankers. Did you know that? Yeah, apparently. Oh yes, apparently. So this is quite nerve-wracking. Up your own asses, apparently. But that's fine. I happen to love this city. And what I did to prepare, because, as I say, I don't have an act as such, is I put out to my followers, on Twitter, I put out a question, name a number of subjects on which I could discourse or expatiate. And I got an enormous number of replies, and I couldn't help noticing that most of them had the letter W in them. See, obviously a lot of them started with what, where, who, why, how. People on Twitter can't spell. And, but also the subject matters seem to be involving the letter W. You see, I do occasionally glance round. And so I thought I would speak on a number of subjects that begin with the letter W, because that really is a way of focusing us all on lots of different things. If you know, it's a bit like writing poetry. If you have free verse, if you can just write in any way you want, then you look out of the window and you suck the end of your pen and nothing gets written. But if someone says you have to write a sonnet of 14 lines and it has to be an iambic pentameter and it has to rhyme according to this scheme, then it's sort of like filling in a grid. So I have these W's that I thought I would speak about. I've jotted them down here because I can't possibly be expected to remember them all because they're rather weird. Well, the first one is who, obviously. And someone asked me about a program which probably hasn't been shown over here, or maybe it has. It's called Who Do You Think You Are? And it's a British program in which you follow your ancestors. Right? Now, the reason I mention this first, although I did actually scribble it down, as I say, completely in random order, so how these things come out is a matter of guesswork, is because it occurred to me that although you are mostly, I suspect, Australians, and I am mostly not, we are very closely related. And it's an odd thing. I'm not a mathematician. There may be mathematicians in the audience, but most of us are probably more literate than we are numerate in this world. It just so happens. And yet we're not stupid. We know what is obviously true. Now, when I was asked by the BBC to do this genealogy program, Who Do You Think You Are? It's a quite interesting way of doing it because they basically say you've got 2.5 weeks of filming, carry a passport with you at all times, that's it. You don't know anything else. A car comes to pick you up in the morning. For all you know, you're going to fly to South Africa or indeed to Australia or to Central Europe, in my case, for the Jewish side of my family. And you've no idea what you're going to discover. And it's a very exciting thing to do. We would all dream of doing it. It's just wonderful when you've got a broadcasting company who does all the work for you and pays for the genealogists and so on. But I was talking to someone about doing this, and they said, "Oh, I do envy you." And their surname, for the sake of argument, was Clark. And they said, "You know, there have been Clarks in my part of Yorkshire for 300 years." And I thought, what a peculiar thing to say. And I'll tell you why it's peculiar. It's because, as you probably know, our surnames in our culture are based on the surnames of our father, whose surname is based on his father's surname, and so on. But it doesn't take too much for us to recognize that we have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16 great-great-grandparents, 32 great-great-great-grandparents, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1024, 2048, 4096, and so on. And then in a few generations, you have tens of thousands of ancestors, each one of whom is as responsible for your existence as the other. Go back in time and pluck one of them out of history, and you cannot exist. And only one out of 4,096 has that surname that you think is somehow who you are. But who you are is a vast panoply of people. So much so that if any of you has English or indeed Scottish blood in your veins, then you must be related to Henry IV, because you have more ancestors going back then than the population of Britain. So all I really wanted to say at the outset is hello, brothers and sisters. It's that simple. Anyway, let's have a look at the first W I scribbled down after that. Well, it's my... I was asked about WWW, the worldwide... Hello, welcome. Please don't... Just at least be grateful that nobody's looking at you. Thanks. Glad you made it. I know traffic in Sydney is 10 types of arse pig, so it's incredible you got here at all. I'm just in a hotel in the Rocks. It took me 20 minutes to get here, so anyway. I should have swum. That would have been more fun. It's a peculiar thing about the World Wide Web that we say in English www, which is literally 3 times more syllables than World Wide Web. WWW is 9 arsing syllables. It's not an abbreviation, is it? It's World Wide Web. But actually, I wanted to concentrate on my WWW. I grew up in England in essentially the 1960s and 70s. I was born in 1957. So my first conscious memories are of the 60s, really the late 60s when I was 10, and then through the 70s when I started to expand like some rare and beautiful flower. And it was in this time that I was blessed stroke cursed, initially you might think a curse, with a condition really very close to insomnia. I found it very, very difficult ever to get to sleep. And the only solution for me was not television or the internet, because although television existed, our parents allowed one television in a sort of servant's cupboard in a small room in the corner of the house, whereas it was expected to behave itself and only come out on royal occasions or possibly Wimbledon. And and it was black and white. My mother said rather desperately when somebody insisted on seeing the news, oh my God, they said, it's black and white. My mother said, well, we got one of the very early colour ones, but it's faded. Pathetic. Anyway, so instead of television, I had reading. I had reading. It was the lifeblood for me. And the first real passion I had, the WWW of my literary firmament, were Wodehouse, Waugh, and Wilde. P.G. Wodehouse, Evelyn Waugh, and Oscar Wilde. And they mean still to this day absolutely everything to me. And I find it hard to believe that I could actually place one word after another in any kind of meaningful or coherent sentence were it not for these 3 masters of English prose. As it happens, Waugh was a huge admirer of Wodehouse, and it was only because of that I ever read an Evelyn Waugh. I was so steeped in P.G. Wodehouse from the age of about 8 or 9 when I read my first collection of Jeeves stories. And on the back of every Penguin edition, there would be a quotation from Evelyn Waugh. He creates a world before the fall that liberates us from the one more irksome, and words to that effect. And I thought, who is this Evelyn Waugh who is quoted on the back of every P.G. Wodehouse? So I started to read him. And I mention that because it leads me on to my next set of W's. I'm going to come back to Wodehouse and I'm going to come back to Wilde. But Waugh's first novel, Decline and Fall, depicts a youngish man called Paul Pennyfeather who, when he's sent down from university, has nothing better to do than go and teach in an English prep school. I don't know if you have the equivalent here. You have some very smart schools. There's one not far from here. I always think, it just amuses me as a name, that if you lose something, like this afternoon I did, I lost my special key that lets me into my dressing room here in the Sydney Opera House. I don't know how I did it. I was given it at the stage door, put it in my pocket. By the time I got to the stage door, I'd lost it, and there was a bit of a kerfuffle. And I was speculating on what happens to material that disappears, like, socks and glasses and car keys and that stash of Coke you paid much. Sorry, that other things. Yeah, a bottle of Coca-Cola, for example, might disappear. And it occurred to me they're transformed into paramatter. And it's just one of those weird things. There had to be a use for paramatter. And it turns out it's what things are turned into when they disappear. Oh, Christ, it's gone to Parramatta. What a terrible thing. But anyway, don't know how we got there. Oh, yes, yeah. I know there are famous, quite English styles. There's King's School Parramatta, isn't there? Are there any King's School Parramatta alumni here? Too ashamed. Interesting. Anyway, so whether you have prep schools as well, I was sent away at the age of 7 to a prep school. It was 200 miles away, which in England is quite a long way. I'm aware, A, that in Australia it's no distance, and B, you have no idea what a mile is because you sold out to the bloody French with your mètre, your kilomètre, to which you are welcome. Yeah, that's why our traffic's so bad, because it's all in kilometres. It's in London, you just get around everywhere. It's zoom about. Because we've got miles. It's miles better. Whoever said it's kilometers better? It doesn't make sense. Anyway, sorry, we're going off on a tangent. I do apologize. I was sent 200 miles away from home, which is a long way, as I say in England, at the age of 7 to a prep school. And had a lot of trouble there, as I did in my other schools, got expelled from a lot of them, ended up in prison. It's a whole other story. It's a whole other kettle of bull waxes. But essentially, what I wanted to concentrate on is the fact that, rather extraordinarily, to me at least, after leaving prison, it was a nice, perfectly pleasant prison. Well, any prison, really, is a breeze after you've had an English private education, to be perfectly honest. For heaven's sake, they tend to use lubricant. Well, no, it's... scrap that thought. No. Anyway, after prison, low down in my spirits, that I felt something had to be done with my life. It was an extraordinary moment, actually, for me, be quite serious in a way, is that I decided I would get the exams that I needed to try and go to university. And having been expelled from so many schools, I had no exams at all, none that would fit me for university. So literally the day after I got out of prison, on probation, on two years probation, I went to Norwich, city in the east of England, the capital of the area in which I grew up, East Anglia. Hooray for Norwich! Well, on the ball city. That's a football thing, don't worry about it. They had a local college where you could enroll for a course of these exams that might qualify me for university. And it was the second day of registration, and I was quite late because we lived right in the middle of the country, and you had to get a coach and then catch another coach and eventually get into Norwich. And I ran to the place. I was at the end of the queue, and I got finally to this little smiley man. I can still picture him. He looked a little like, it's not relevant that you should know this, but he looked a little like the famous theatre director Peter Brook. I don't know if that helps you picture him. Rather gnome-like, benevolent face, little shiny, twinkly blue eyes. I got there, and he said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want to do A-levels in English, French, and history of art." This is an English exam thing. You do 3 of these. And he said, "Oh, they're all full up. They're all full up." I said, "No, they can't be." He said, "No, I'm afraid they're all full up. There's nothing. We might get you into a history of art, but really." I said, "Listen, if you accept me, I will get A grades in all of them, and I will also take the separate exam on my own to enter Cambridge, and I will get a scholarship." And he looked at me and said, "What? We don't do Cambridge. We don't do teaching for the Cambridge exam." I said, "I know, I'll do it on my own, but I promise you, I will get A's and I will get a scholarship." And then it was as if my whole life was in suspension. And he looked at me and I looked at him, really scared inside. I didn't really know what I was saying. And he said, "All right." I don't know why. I was not to know that that moment was the hinge on which the rest of my life was to swing, but it turned out that it was, quite honestly. Fortunately, I did as I had sworn to him I would do. And after I had got the news that I'd got this scholarship to my college at Cambridge, I had a year before starting there, what is known as a gap year. Now, most students sort of pretend to be New Zealand. They pretend to be Kiwis. They put on some sort of nylon-based outer garment wear, and they go to the Inca Trail and they despoil all the great places of the world in their bright colours and rather that Scooby-Doo character, scruffy beards, and their otherwise charming New Zealand ways. And that's sort of what all students do now, I think, isn't it? They do the Inca Trail, or they go to Southeast Asia somewhere, and they generally pollute the outer reaches of the world until they've grown up. And but I didn't do that. I wanted to emulate Paul Pennyfeather from Evelyn Waugh's Decline and Fall. I wanted a job as a prep school teacher. And I maybe because I've been expelled from so many schools, I felt that it was my job really to to prove to myself that I was no longer an outsider, that I was perhaps an insider for the last time in my life. And so I went to this extraordinary place in Piccadilly in central London called Gabbitas and Thring. Extraordinarily Dickensian name, but I promise you it exists. And Gabbitas and Thring, which reminds me there was a fabulous, slightly queenie Australian actor called Frank Thring, wasn't there? Yeah, probably, great man. I remember him in, wasn't he Pontius Pilate in Ben-Hur? Fabulous, fabulous figure. Am I wrong to call him slightly queenie? No, I don't know. Anyway, but he was the last of that generation of Australian actors who spoke in a more English accent than any Englishman who ever lived. Anyway, it's nice to be here on the stage of the Sydney Opera House and remember Frank Thring. Frank, there you are. Good. So I went to Gabbitas and Thring and said that I wanted a job teaching as an assistant master in some sort of school if they could help out. And they said, we'll put you in our books and we'll get back to you. So I took a train back to Norfolk, back to my parents' house. And 2 days later, my father said, phone call for you. And I picked up the phone and they said, jubilant news, young Mr. Fry. I said, what is it? They said, we have a very nice little prepper in North Yorkshire where the classics master, Mr. Kemp Welsh, slipped on the ice and has sustained a fracture to his pelvic girdle. And I remember that phrase exactly, pelvic girdle? Does anybody say pelvic girdle? But anyway, they did. And I said, gosh, North Yorkshire is quite a long way again by British terms. And they said, but no, happily, the father of the headmaster lives in Norfolk, and he will interview you for the post. And I said, oh, well, that's fantastic. So he gave me the address, and I bicycled over to this old rectory not far from where I lived. And there was a splendid old fellow who said, hello, come in. His name was Valentine, and a tremendous fellow, Mr. Valentine. I can't remember his first name. His son was Jeremy Valentine, was the headmaster of the school. He said, hello, lovely to see you, lovely to see you. Now, you've got a scholarship to Queen's, haven't you? He said, I'm trying to remember who the great cricketers who've ever been through Queen's College were. He said there was Oliver Popwell, who was a very decent wicket-keeper batsman. I remember him. There must have been others in my time. He then went on talking about P.B.H. May, who played for England. And I eventually said, what sort of duties would be required as a teacher? He said, well, Latin and Greek, you sound on those? I said, immensely sound Latin and Greek. He said, probably a little history and some French, I think, and some of the other masters may want you to fill in with their subjects too, and refereeing perhaps some rugby. And I thought, oh my God, I don't know the first thing about rugby. And cricket. I said, cricket is good. He said, excellent. And you've got a scholarship. Queen's very, very good. Very good. Excellent. Well, do give them all my best wishes, won't you? I said, what do you mean I've got the job? He said, oh, yes, you seem immensely sound. So that's how in those days you were given in charge of 100 or so young, impressionable minds. And I arrived the very next day at this school. It was an enormous parsonical master with his standing in front of the hearth, who said, it's our new classics bod, he said, hello. Ronnie Noakes, come and warm your ass by the fire, he said. And we had an exciting discussion about whether I preferred Thompson and Craddock or Kennedy in terms of Latin primers. And then the headmaster came in and said, excellent, good to see you. And the very first lesson the next day, he said, he said, Barry's a little unwell, so you're going to have to take his biology tomorrow morning. I said, biology? Oh, God, I imagined. At school, I remember cutting up frogs and all kinds of unpleasant things. I arrived the next morning at the chapel and the prayers, and I eventually tracked down the headmaster, and I said, what am I supposed to be teaching this form? He said, it's upper fifth. Upper fifth. He said, Barry wrote a note for you, here it is. And I read it. He said, dear Mr. Fry, I hope to meet you soon. Sorry, I can't teach it. Upper fifth, they're very smart, don't worry, covering human reproduction. So that was my introduction to teaching, was human. It was a magnificent time, and it gave me some extraordinary insight into myself as much as anyone else. I don't know if any of you here are teachers, but I have to say, and I'm not saying this to crawl to you, but I have never in all my life done anything as hard, just in terms of tiring and exhausting and mind and body consuming as teaching. It is one of the most extraordinarily hard jobs you could ever do. Somehow your body gets used to it, but after the first 3 days, I was very, very minded to run away. I didn't. I stayed the course, and in fact, I continued to go back to that school to teach while I was at university. But that brings me on to another W, which is writing. Now, this is a very important one for me because writing is something I do all the time. There's I don't know if you're familiar with it, there's a marvelous Michael Powell film called The Red Shoes. And it's one of the great films. He's one of the great directors, Michael Powell. There's a scene in it that means a great deal to me. It's quite corny in a way, but it's so perfectly done because it's Michael Powell, and written by Emmerich, of course, and Pressburger, Emmerich Pressburger. And there's Moira Shearer plays this young girl who's a ballet dancer. And there's a kind of Diaghilev figure, an entrepreneur, an impresario, I should say, played by the fabulous actor Anton Walbrook, who's one of my favorite film actors there ever was. And her mother takes her to an opera house, the Royal Opera House, as it happens. The Sydney Opera House, quite simply, hadn't been built. And otherwise, they would have used it, because it's better and more famous and bigger and just somehow less English and more Australian and wonderful, therefore. So, but anyway, she goes to see this ballet, and in the interval, there is this impresario played by Anton Walbrook, and the mother drags her up to him, taps him on the shoulder, and he turns around rather wearily. And she says, "I want to introduce my daughter, who's a magnificent young ballet dancer, and she should join your company. She wants to join your company." And he raises languid eyes and looks at her and says, "Why do you want to join my company?" She said, "Well, Moira Shearer says, the daughter, she says, I've heard it's really very good, and it's the best, I think. You're absolutely wonderful, and I like dancing, and I think it would be wonderful fun." And he just simply turns his back on her and walks away. And the mother goes, "Well," and drags her daughter back. "What a rude man." But you can see she stands there, the daughter, Moira Shearer, absolutely fixed, and the camera moves in on her face. Her eyes are sparkling with, you can't tell what. Is it fury because he's been rude? It's something very big to her. And she goes up to him. She taps him on the shoulder this time, not her mother. And he turns around and then he looks really annoyed. "What?" He says, "I just want to say that I was wrong with what I told you. And I said I want to join your company because it's a good company. And I like to dance. It's not that I like to dance. I have to dance. It's what I was put on the planet to do. It's what I'm here to do. I have to dance." And he stares at her. "Come around tomorrow morning," he says. And then her career begins. It's a wonderful moment because you do realize that for some people, lucky people, there is this imperative, this absolute need to do something. You just know it's what you have to do. And it almost doesn't matter whether or not anybody's going to pay you to do it. You have to do it. Now, in the case of ballet dancing, it sort of does matter that someone's going to pay you to do it because doing it on your own is a little tiresome and a little peculiar, and it draws attention from quite the wrong sort of people, I would imagine. But in my case, it was writing. It was something I had to do. And one of the reasons I had to do it was the second W of my WWW. The third, actually, Oscar Wilde. Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde. I think I was about 11 when I saw, talking of English films, I saw Puffin Asquith, as he was known. I saw his version of The Importance of Being Earnest. The first time I'd ever seen the play. Had Dame Edith Evans and Michael Redgrave and Michael Denison, Miles Malleson, Margaret Rutherford, an extraordinary cast, and Joan Greenwood and Dorothy Tewtin. And I remember Michael Denison as Algernon saying to Dorothy Tewtin at one point, "Would you be in any way offended if I said that you seem to me to be the visible personification of absolute perfection?" And I looked at that as a 10 or 11-year-old, and it was as if a curtain had lifted in my mind. I've never been able to sing. We may have a chance to get to that subject, thorny as it is. and I can't dance, and I couldn't play sport. But I knew I had within me some bursting passion for words. And they are the biggest W in my life of all. Words and writing. And when I heard that, would you be in any way offended if I said that you seemed to me to be the visible personification of absolute perfection? I knew that I was in the presence of something quite extraordinary. And you can parse it and examine it and analyze it. It's kind of witty because Wilde is using extremely Latinate words for romancing, and they're usually rather technical, the visible personification of absolute perfection. Not I love you dreamily, but that. And it was somehow all the more seductive. And so I remember we had this mobile library right in the middle of the country, and once a week, every Thursday, this van would come, and if you got there in time, you would flag it down, and it would stop, and you'd climb into it, and you'd get all the books out. And I got out everything written by Oscar Wilde, and including The Importance of Being Earnest, which I learned off by heart. Did you hear what I was playing on the piano, Lane? I didn't think it polite to listen, and so it goes. That's the first two lines. I'm sorry for that, for your sake. I don't play the piano accurately. Anybody can play accurately. So far as the piano is concerned, sentiment is my forte. And so, and on it goes. And it is the most magnificent piece of work, but it was the fact that this same thing I'm using to you now, this expulsion of air through the pharynx and larynx, out of the mouth and into the public world, can be beautiful, can be entirely, exquisitely beautiful. The very sound of a tongue hitting the back of the teeth, the procession, the rhythm of words can entrance, seduce, delight, thrill, and win the world. And it's a power we all have inside us. Those of us who can speak, can use language in the same way that a dancer uses dance and a painter uses paint. It's the most magnificent thing we have, and yet, oddly enough, the most ignored. It's what separates us from all other species more than anything else, and yet we tend to use it to pick up the phone and order a pizza, or to explode in a coughing fit. That often happens. I'm sorry. It's very sweet of him. Pop away. You'll be welcome to come back the moment you like. We've all done it. An aunt of mine did it in front of Laurence Olivier on stage. He was on stage, she was up in the balcony, she had a coughing fit. He actually stopped and said, "I'll give you a chance to get over it, otherwise leave." Imagine that. But this poor gentleman volunteered on his own. Thank you very much, I'm sorry about that. So language, yes, language entranced me, and from that moment on I was absolutely in the grip of the idea that language could be more than just a way of ordering pizza over the phone. More than just a way of saying, where's the nearest dunny? Not that we use that word in England, I just thought I'd throw in my knowledge of fluent Australian. Right up to the minute, too, you'll notice. So Oscar became something of a passion for me, and it wasn't really much more than a year or so later that I read a biography of him by a man called Hyde White, Montgomery Hyde White, and I discovered... I discovered that through Montgomery Hyde that Oscar was not as other girls. And this was another chime within me that's a whole other story that, again, we may get to. But for the moment, I want to stick with the words and the writing, because it really was from that moment on that I decided and determined that whatever else I might be in the world, it would use language, it would use words, that they were the best I could offer. I was never going to be excessively pretty, charming, handsome, lissom, lithe, enchanting in any other way. But all I had was my voice and my, such as it might be, W for wit. I did discover that words are a magnificent protection against violence, as well as sometimes a magnificent provocation for violence. And at school, I was at an English public school, which, as I'm sure you know, means private school. And there were the kind of bullying, rugby playing types, the ruggerbuggers, you know, and the Philistines. And I remember one of them trying to beat me up, and I discovered the beauty here of words. And I would recommend this. You tell your children, if ever any of them say that they're being threatened by a bully. It always works, this. It's really good. Say, no, don't touch me, don't touch me, don't touch me. You'll give me an erection. You're welcome to use that. It's bloody hell, Fry, actually. Serious. Oh, you're weird. Oh. So anyway, I carried on writing and was more or less left alone, except when I chose not to be. But that's another story as well. So we're fasting forward all the way past this prep school, and I'm at university. I've gone to Cambridge University, which is one of the ancient universities of Britain. It just celebrated its 800th anniversary. So it's been around for a long time, and I was thrilled to be there. Some of the great heroes of my life had been there. Some of the great philosophers like Bertrand Russell and Wittgenstein, and some of the great poets like Wordsworth and Milton and Byron had been there, Tennyson, and of course the greatest scientific breakthroughs really that had ever been almost came from there. Isaac Newton was there, and indeed was MP for Cambridge while he was there. Of course, Crick and Watson discovered DNA there, and Charles Darwin was there. So it was an extraordinary place to know that you were walking on these ancient stones. You were stepping into steps that had been carved by the footsteps, worn down in time by the Byrons of this world. And there were people you could meet who knew E.M. Forster, and it was just an extraordinary place. And also, there was a history of comedy, extraordinary, rich history of comedy. There's a club there, well over 100 years old, called the Footlights Club. And in the 1950s, Peter Cook and Jonathan Miller came there, and they joined with two from Oxford, Alan Bennett and Dudley Moore, and formed this thing called Beyond the Fringe, which really kick-started in my country this whole move of what you might call sort of graduate humour. And it came to a flowering in the 60s when there was John Cleese and Graham Garden and Eric Idle, and there was Bill Oddie and Graham Chapman and Tim Brooke Taylor and a couple of Aussies. There was Jermaine Greer and Clive James, all there, all members of the Footlights, all writing material for it. And it went on all the way through Griffiths Jones and a huge number of people. And so this was this terrifying thing. You arrive at Cambridge and you think you might be reasonably amusing, and oh my goodness, there's this extraordinary institution. You couldn't dream that you'd ever get into it. And indeed I didn't. I spent my first 2 years writing a lot, sort of journalism for the student magazines and reviews and things. Yes, I did write reviews. I was that much of a scum-sucking pig. But I've given up that. I don't do that anymore. No, it's right. We have nothing but respect for reviewers, especially the reviewers I most love are any reviewers that happen to be in here at the moment. They're just the loveliest and most special people that I've ever met. I went to a production early on of a play, Tom Stoppard's Travesties. It was absolutely magnificent. Really was extraordinary. It was really, I thought, brilliant for a student production. But what absolutely took my eye was this girl who came on stage. She played one of the parts in it. And it was the moment she stepped on stage, you just knew this was someone of extraordinary talent. I don't know, it's a bit like falling in love, it's a bit like fear, it's a bit like hate or extreme ugliness or extreme beauty. It's a visceral, physical, absolute quality. She stepped on stage and I thought, oh my heavens, what an extraordinary talent. She opened her voice. There are two qualities you need to succeed on stage, I think. One is you need to reassure an audience that everything's going to be fine. Your voice is going to solace and hit their ear. You're not going to be embarrassing or break down, or you're not so nervous as to cause disruption. You can just lean back and know that you're in the hands of someone fine. But in sharp contradistinction and counterintuitively, it's just as important that you somehow make people almost lean forward, that there's a tension and an excitement in the way you perform that it's an edge. And this girl had both. You knew she was in charge of herself, but you also knew that there was something fantastically exciting and something almost explosive about the way she walked on the stage and spoke. Anyway, I was lucky enough to get to know her, we became friends, and her name, it may not surprise you to know, was Emma Thompson. And she was, an extraordinary woman. I'll just tell you a story that will give an example of how obvious it was to anyone who saw her when she was just a student, that she was nominated for an Oscar for her as an actress for her performance as Margaret Schlegel in Howard's End, and A lot of us who knew her were called up by the press, as you often are. And it's a sort of unwritten rule, you won't be surprised to know, that when the press call you, you don't speak about other people. Not unless you have the direct consent that it's an official thing. It's just bad form. You speak about yourself if you're so minded, but you don't blab about other people. So they hadn't got very far with her friends, but they found the number of a close friend of hers who was not a famous actor or anything like that, and he was rather caught on the hop when they said, "We just want to know what your feelings are about Emma being nominated for an Oscar." And he said, "Well, I'll be quite frank with you. I feel, and I think most of her friends do, extremely let down by Emma Thompson." And he said, "You can actually hear the drool hitting the carpet on the other end of the line." The fellow licked his pencil and went, yeah. He said, "Yes, anybody who ever saw Emma Thompson as an actress when she was a student would have laid any money that she would get an Oscar before she was 30. I think she'll be just over 30 when she gets this one next month." And he basically said all there was to be said. Anyway, we became friends and we were in a number of plays together, Shakespeare plays. I was, it's a strange thing when you're a student and you're doing plays. This is Cambridge, by the way. It's not a drama school, so this was not official. These were all extracurricular. I was supposedly doing a degree in English literature, but spending all my time really having an immensely good larky time in plays. And because most of the undergraduacy, if that's a word, were really between about 18 and 21, 22, obviously you had old people in plays. And I, because of my height and the depth of my voice and some quality of, let's be unkind to me and call it almost unacceptable pomposity, I was tended to be cast as kings and old figures of warty dukes and things of that nature. Sometimes a good part, sometimes even the lead part in the play, but often you come on and bless the, the couple at the end, and it would be like that. While all the trim, pert undergraduates played the love interests, the Romeos and the Juliets. And that was fine. And so I did a lot of those, some of them with Emma. But in my second year, this is where it relates to writing, to Evelyn Waugh, and to the story I was telling you about the prep school, I was asked if I might write a play. And I said, what makes you think I can write a play? I'd never written any play before. I'd never written anything involving dialogue of that nature. I'd written lots of stories and poems, and I'd written the odd sort of humorous article in Broadsheet, the Cambridge magazine at the time. They said, "No, I think you will be able to." So that holiday, or VAC as they were called at university, I sat down at an old manual typewriter, Hermes typewriter, and I thought, well, all I can write a play on is what I know about, and really, all I know about is schools and prisons, but I couldn't really. Cambridge hadn't asked me if I was on probation. It's not a thing they ask their students when they come. I didn't think it polite to volunteer the information, so I thought just best leave that alone for the time being. So I wrote a play really about a prep school set in the strange English world. It was called Latin. And it was a comedy, a sort of satire on the peculiarity of these places and the strange sexual goings-on. And it was accounted something of a success, and a company wanted to take it up to Edinburgh, where there's a big festival, as you probably know. It's the biggest sort of fringe festival of its kind. Nothing like what the old Adelaide Festival was, obviously, but it's still jolly impressive. And I remember Emma coming to it, and she brought a friend of hers, and I remember he was a tall chap with sort of triangular red banners of blush mark on his cheeks. I mean, not blusher, but he just had sort of naturally sort of rather flushed cheeks and big blue eyes. And I said, "Hello," and he said, "Hello." And that was sort of it, really. And the play carried on, and it won an award, which was very nice. And I felt rather grand. I felt I am a writer for the first time in my life. And then the next term, which was the beginning of my last year, Emma came around to my room and she said, "I want you to meet the president of the Footlights." I said, "Who's the president of the Footlights?" "I don't know. Why would all the Footlights? That's all very pro-y comedy people." She said, "Well, you've written a comedy play. You can write sketches. You could write monologues. You could do that. Come and see him. He's called Hugh Laurie." And I said, "Well, yeah, isn't it amazing?" I said, I know him. I went to see the Footlights show in the first year. But I thought he must be a third year because he hasn't been in the Footlights since. And she told me the story, which is that Hugh had come up to Cambridge expressly to row, to pull a boat through the water. We've mentioned Frank Thring and Ben Hur, and we know that rowing is essentially something for convicts and galley slaves. But it seems that this Hugh Laurie, who had been expensively educated at Eton College, had devoted most of his teenage to pulling a boat through the water for fun. He was allowed to use the street unsupervised, and for all I knew, he could even use a telephone without supervision as well. But that's what he did. He arrived to Cambridge and comble de malchance, as the French say, huge misfortune struck him, glandular fever, mononucleosis, as I believe they call it in America. He had this, which you get from kissing strange girls, I believe. But anyway, he got this condition, which meant that he couldn't row. And some Etonian friends said, well, you're a bloody funny fellow, actually. Seriously, no, bloody hell, actually. Really, join the bloody Footlights. You know, you'd be really funny. So Hugh said, okay, and that's where I saw him in the Footlights. And I have to say, I saw him and Emma Thompson, and Emma's boyfriend at the time, an extraordinary clownish actor called Simon McBurney, whom you may know from the Theatre of Complicité, the Théâtre de Complicité, brilliant fellow. And I just thought he was so good that it was almost unbelievable. And as I say, I then didn't see him in the second year, because in the second year he went back to this rowing thing. And then at the end of his second year, round about the time that he came to Edinburgh and saw my play Latin, he was supposedly debating within himself whether to be the president of the Cambridge University Boat Club or to be the president of the Footlights. Occasionally in an interview he claims he tossed a coin and it came down Footlights. But anyway, he found himself president of Footlights with only Emma Thompson, really, who had ever been in a Footlight show before, because all the second and third years had cleared out, and so he wanted someone to write with. So Emma takes me to his rooms in his college, and the door is opened by his girlfriend Katie, and there's Hugh, and I can picture the scene exactly, sitting on a bed with a guitar, and he went, hello, and I said, hello. We are people who actually spell hello H-U-L-L-O when we speak to each other. And he said, I've written a song. It's the first thing he said. I think Katie said, would you like a cup of coffee? But he said, I've written a song. So he played the song. It was a marvelous song, made me laugh very much. And he showed me, I'm writing this stuff. And essentially, we started writing there and then. It was the most extraordinary thing. I can say this to you, Sydney. I fell in love. But it was a wonderful kind of love because it was a comic love. It was a professional love. It was a collaborative love. I'm very happy to say, being something of a young bender, that I didn't fall in love with him in that way. Because handsome and striking as he is, that would have been deeply embarrassing and difficult for both of us, I suspect. And I think he with me, we fell in love with each other in the way that people who work together do. And it was another extraordinary turning point in my life. We started writing there and then. We wrote the panto, then we wrote a show, and then we went to Edinburgh. And this will sort of bring me... How are we doing on minutes, Esther? It's about 45, right? I'll finish up, because we've got our little question and answer session to come. But essentially, this brings us to no, shush and behave. It brings us to where we are now, in a sense, that when it got to Edinburgh, our show, we knew there was this thing called the Perrier Award, which was like, had just been instituted that year, which was the best comedy show on the Fringe. We also knew that the last institution that would ever win it would be the Cambridge Footlights, because, you know, we were old school. And what was beginning, this is 1981, was this new world of stand-up comedy. And we were all very much sketches, you know, knock, 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 come in, Perkins. And the sketch would begin. Or it would be someone going, hello, I'd like to buy something that you obviously won't have in this shop. And so the sketch would develop. You know, that's a noble tradition. But instead, we were getting very angry, earnest people, quite rightly, railing at the world, and we were really in no position to do that, living in panelled rooms with servants making our beds every day. So, yeah, quite. But anyway, we were standing on stage like this, and we'd finished the show one evening, and we were bowing, and there was this kind of kerfuffle. It was really odd, kerfuffle. And I turned and I thought, what the hell? And walking on stage was a man who had just become very famous because of a television series called Not the 9 O'Clock News. It was Rowan Atkinson, who was walking on stage. And the audience obviously all recognized him. And he went, can I, and we were thinking, this Rowan Atkinson, he's always been a bit weird. I mean, brilliant, but weird. He's actually gone mad. But he said, I would like very much to make the happy announcement that we have won the Perry Award. Then he did a bit of Mr. Bean's kind of, and obviously the audience laughed more than they had at us throughout the entire evening. But that was okay, because then on came the award-giving party and they gave us his award. And one of the things that happened, I think, as a result of that was that we were asked to perform the show on British television, and we got a contract, and we started a comic career, if you can call it that. But the most exciting for our purposes here is that a man called Michael Edgley asked if we would be asked if we would be interested in touring Australia. And a month or so later, we arrived in Sydney and then immediately went to Perth and did a tour. It was 1981. Some of you elderly gentlemen may remember. More gentlemen I use distinctly rather than ladies, although I'm sure many ladies will too, was the year that Ian Botham single-handedly wrested the ashes from your nerveless fingers. And so our show was called Botham the Musical, just as a way of dropping a few lemon splashes onto the paper cut. And you've had your revenge a few times since, obviously. But I think, who has the ashes now? Let me just remember. Oh, yeah. It's the same people who beat you in the World 2020 final, wasn't it? Oh, and the last ODI. And a rugby match. Anyway, no, great. It's how often can an Englishman stand on the stage and say any of those things? Let's be honest. Might as well enjoy it. So that's when I came to Australia. And Australia taught me a number of things. Most importantly, how to eat and drink. It was an incredibly exciting place to visit from a rather shabby, unhappy England. In 1981, Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister. It was before the Falklands War and before yuppies and the explosion of a kind of credit boom and a new confidence. It was still a pretty grotesque place, England, to eat and to live. It was pretty grey, although I'd lived a privileged life in some ways. We all knew that Australia was like, it's as if someone had pressed the colour button, and there was a lively and extraordinary, vibrant country where you sold wine varietally, which we'd never done in England. So I learnt about grapes. You could buy a Penfolds Grange for under $100. Can you imagine? And $100 was only about £2 in those days. And despite the peculiarity that you had to take the bottle to almost every bloody restaurant, there was also oysters and crayfish. Oysters Kilpatrick and oysters Rockefeller and oysters Casino. And I mean, it was just unbelievable, the food. I'd never had anything so plentiful and fresh and cheap and exciting, and the attitude absolutely overwhelmed me. It was a really remarkable experience. So I have forever since then been unbelievably grateful to Australia for opening my eyes to the pleasures of the table, but also for opening my eyes to a whole new continent with which I am deeply fond, of which I am deeply fond. And so it is really a strange journey from Woodhouse and war and wild and schools and writing and Cambridge to this great city. Thank you so much, Sydney. Thank you very much indeed. You're very kind. Thank you, Esther. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Oh, you're so wonderful. Thank you. Now, I'm going to go off. Thank you. Oh, bless you. Thank you so much. Thank you. You are lovely. You are unbelievably kind. Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm going to go off now. Some rather attractive young men are going to do a little bit of stage building, which will take about 30 or 40 seconds, and then I will come on with Jennifer, and we will have something of a Q&A. See you in a bit. Hello. Goodness. Well,
I think we'd all agree, actually, isn't it? W, as it turns out, stands also for wonderful.
oh,
Would you like to thank him again? Look, let's begin by... No, I want to pick up actually on some of the things that you left, the gaps in the story.
Yeah.
The gaps in the story. I mean, as you say in your autobiography, the first autobiography, that you could read well at 3, and that you were writing accurately at 4. You've already told us that by 11 you were in love with the words of Oscar Wilde, yet we almost didn't hear your voice. I think you should tell us about how the world actually was given you by your voice coach, without whom no one would have understood anything.
Well, I gabbled. I spoke incredibly quickly. I mean, so quickly. And I was completely puzzled. Do you know there's a Star Trek episode where there's a... It's very important. Most of human history and art can be expressed in Star Trek plots. And it's true. Just to go with a slight side thing, I actually did the finals of my Cambridge degree was on the subject of Nietzsche and tragedy, and I mostly wrote about Star Trek, and I have to say I got a very good degree. It's partly because, just in case you wanted to write an essay about Nietzsche and Star Trek, was that Nietzsche argued that all tragedy was based on an opposition between the Apollonian and the Dionysiac instincts in ancient Greece, and particularly Greek tragedy. In other words, the Dionysiac instinct for wine and revel and feasting, the id, as you might say, the animal part of us. And against that was the Apollonian, the harmonic, logic, reason, rhetoric. And that the Greek civilization was playing out in front of itself the story of its own beginnings, from blood feuds and trials and tribal wars and appetite and sexual lust and animal instincts, and this extraordinary thing of logic and reason that it had founded through Aristotle and the philosophers, and music and Pythagoras and everything else. And the two were constantly at war, as they are in all of us, of course, which is why tragedy is so fantastic a medium. And oddly enough, that's what most Star Trek stories are about. That you have the captain in the middle who is trying to balance both his humanity and his reason. And on his left shoulder in the original Star Trek, you have the appetitive, physical Dr. McCoy. Everything's, And on his right shoulder, you have Spock, who is all reason. And they're both flawed because they don't balance the two. And they're at war with each other. Bones is always having a go at Spock. And Kirk is in the middle, representing the perfect solution. And not only that, the planets they visit usually make the mistake of being either over-ordered and over-reasonable and over-logical, so they kill those who would dissent, and they do it calmly and reasonably, and they have to learn to be a bit human. You will learn to be human. And or they are just a savage race that needs reason and order. So it's that quest of the universe. Anyway, that's why Star Trek is incredibly important, of course.
And the connection with
there is a Star Trek plot where there is a race who live at incredible speed. And they live so fast you can't see them. And there's just a noise. And through some use of, it's pre-tachyon beams, but through some particular technology, they manage to go onto their sphere, and so you see all the rest, everyone's like this, and the new beings are like that. Anyway, I was like that. I was super fast. I was unbelievably hyper. I spoke so quickly, I had to have elocution lessons because nobody could understand a word I said.
What did you sound like?
I was just because I wanted to talk like that, and it came out like that, and
Yes.
And people say, stop gabbling. And I couldn't understand it because I was living faster than anybody else, I think. I think now, looking back at it, I would probably have been diagnosed with attention deficit disorder and given, Rohypnol or what. No.
Ritalin.
Ritalin. I knew it began with R. This explains so many of my problems with my drugs. Really does.
Seriously, do you ever think how your life may have been different if some well-meaning doctor had prescribed you with Rohypnol?
It's interesting.
Ritalin.
How well-meaning would he have been, I wonder?
Yeah.
It would have been more likely a Catholic priest, let's be honest. But no. Well, of course, it is now understood to be quite a common path is to have attention deficit disorder or hyperactivity and so on, and then to develop the conditions that are then called bipolar disorder. It's quite a common route, and I do have that to some extent, and maybe this was the thing. I was so hyper and so fast. So this wonderful woman, who herself sounded as if, when she spoke, like a lot of these elderly English ladies who wore sort of lavender cardigans and beads, and her hair in a massive bun with a sort of steel knitting needle stuck through it, and wisps falling down. And she always spoke to my ear as if she was breathing in when she spoke. "Hello, dear. How are you? Leon, now I want you to say this." It was that sort of strange voice. And she would get me to say things like, the thing would be Betty, right? We don't know who Betty was, it was never explained, but Betty had a bit of, bitter butter, it turns out, which she added to her batter, which, as you can probably imagine, rendered said batter rather bitter. But it's all right, it has a happy ending, because Betty then took a bit of better butter and put it in that very bitter batter that I spoke of earlier, and ameliorated its condition. And so I would say Betty had a bit of butter, put it in a batter, made a batter better, then Betty took a bit of better butter and put it in a bit of batter, made a bit of batter better. And she would say, "Slow down, dear." And eventually I would learn to say, "Betty had a bit of bitter butter and put it in her batter and made her batter bitter. Breathe, dear." Then Betty took a bit of better butter and put it in her bitter batter and made her bitter batter better. "That's better." And so that's kind of how I learned.
You are a credit to your coach. Do you have favourite words that you just want to go, that the very sound of them you love? You want to use every opportunity?
Sometimes they're place names. I became very obsessed with a village near me in Norfolk called Snetterton. And I would drive my mother crazy just by saying Snetterton. Snetterton. And we'd be driving along. I'd say, "Oh, Mummy," and she'd go, "Yes." I'd go, "Snetterton." I'd go, "Oh!" And she'd always fall for it. And I just, to this day, I sometimes on the phone go, "Snetterton." And she'd go, "Oh, shh."
You said that your facility, your dexterity with language, proved a great kind of shield against bullies at school. However, counterbalancing that, I would have thought, was that about 7 or 8, you gave up any sort of possibility of collecting butterflies or football cards. You started to collect facts.
Yes.
Now, there's nothing worse
more
than
annoying.
a lippy know-all. Yeah. So how did that balance out?
It didn't.
Good with words, dull with facts.
There was nothing worse than me when I was young, I suspect. It coincided with a number of things. I virtually memorized some of the sections of the Guinness Book of Records. So I was able to say the longest ever episode of hiccups without cessation was Ronald Perdue in 1957, who for 13 years, 7 weeks, 4 days, 9 hours and 2 minutes had sustained involuntary spasms of the epiglottis, also known as hiccuping. And by this time the room would be empty, of course.
And the Fry car trips must have been very painful.
They were. Counterbalanced, I've used that word rather too often this evening, but against that must be set the fact that I was also extremely disruptive. Again, part of this mania, despite the fact that I could learn so much, I was almost incapable of concentration, I think. It's certainly in terms of social situations, like a classroom. Couldn't concentrate, so I was always being sent out. I was always a nuisance. I was always lippy. I was always, just a general disruption. And I just felt different. I felt that everyone else was ordinary, but also everyone else was luckier. Everyone else seemed to find life a more natural, less surprising phenomenon. To me, life was a constant puzzle, both as I hit adolescence, an explosion of beauty that took my breath away. So dawn and sunlight and animals and cobwebs caught in the rays of the morning sun, whatever it might be, the smell of earth would just have me in paroxysms of delight. I mean, like a dippy, dizzy, silly romantic poet. And love smoked me amidships too. But also, I couldn't seem to just be ordinary like other people. I didn't like the things they seemed to like. Sport I didn't like. Ironic, I now adore sport, but at the time I really hated it with a passion. I would probably run 6 miles away from the school in order to get away from a running session. That's how peculiar I was.
Did it ever occur to you that there is a connection between that and the naughtinesses, as you say, the hijinks, and eventually the crimes that you got up to, the credit card theft? I mean, you ended up in prison, as you've mentioned.
I find it hard to persuade people sometimes that almost everything that motivates me in life is emotional and appetitive. It is not intellectual. People think that because I speak in the way I do, or because I'm interested in knowledge the way I am, and because I prize logic and reason extremely highly, that therefore I am above, or regard myself as above, emotion, that my whole life has been driven by nothing but desire. And
for?
All kinds of things. It started, I think, with sugar. I know that sounds mad. I write a whole chapter about it, my devotion to it. I was born in the same year as a breakfast cereal called Sugar Puffs. Strange little heat-puffed grains of wheat, glazed in glucose and sugar, and poured into a bowl usually, and to which sugar is added. Or in my case, you know how Americans in cinemas will have these huge buckets of popcorn, and they watch, and they just go like that till it's empty, with a slight film over their eyes, as if they're slightly playing with themselves. There's something slightly peculiar about it. I was like that with Sugar Puffs. I would eat the Sugar Puffs. We'd get through packets a week. My mother thought it was most alarming. So there was sugar. It was this desire. It was a feverish desire. It was absolutely enormous. It was replaced by cigarettes and sex, as things are, as you get older. That was the same physical thing, and they both involve huge amounts of desire followed by huge amounts of raging self-disgust. Or is that just me? I don't know. And in my later years, which will have to be volume 3, I had an episode, typically yawn-worthy, tedious addiction to the South American drug.
The marching powder with this.
Coffee. No, cocaine, yeah. So there was that side of me, and there was love, and there was the passion. And the intellectual side of me was always the servant, and still is the servant of that. And it is of all humans, because we are first animals. We are first, that is the bigger part of us. It's not that the reason is less important. The reason mediates and often loses a battle between desire. And as T.S. Eliot said, between desire and performance, there falls the shadow. And it's that shadow that has dogged me, and it's also the wonderful subtle penumbra in which we all mostly live. It's that exciting place where we try to balance, to fight off Bones and Spock, we return to. And so, for me, appetite is infinitely more the driver of everything I've done.
But was that time that you stole and the credit card theft and fraud, was that about desire for what you could get, or was it just because you felt so different?
I think it might have been because I felt different. We're talking about the very early 70s, 1970, 71 here. There was no internet. Well, there was an internet. It was made of wood and ivory. There were no email addresses. And I had known instinctively, but not necessarily by giving it a name, that I was what we would now call gay. I like to say as a ho-ho joke that I knew very early on that, in fact, the moment I was born, I looked up and said, that's the last time I'm going up one of those. But it's obviously not literally true. But oddly enough, when I did come out to my parents when I was at university, and my mother said, well, of course, dear. I don't think there'd been a time when she wasn't aware of it. I don't know why mothers know these things. But it wasn't easy in the early 70s, for all that I could, be witty, and for all that this discovery of Oscar Wilde and then of his life gave me a hero. He was a doomed hero. He was a tragic hero. And all the heroes there were for me to follow were literary ones. So in a sense, I have my sexuality to thank for the fact that too turned me to reading, because I was desperate. Once I'd read Wilde's biography, you'd learn to look at a bibliography and an index and just chase up every other name. There was Reggie Turner and Robbie Ross, and then there were other generations, Ian Forster, people like that. Robin Morm had written autobiographies, transgressive people who lived lives of sin and in constant danger of being exposed. But they were so often brilliant and creative and remarkable. So they gave me this secret self, and maybe the stealing, I'm not excusing it, and maybe the stealing and the climbing the roof of the church, the chapel roof, and looking down on the school while everyone else was at their rugby and everything, was the thing I liked to do.
Returning to your life, and we were talking about the early 70s, now the early 80s. You were, as you've explained, at Cambridge. You explained why Hugh Laurie went into comedy. It isn't actually obvious why you chose comedy. Why did you?
I'll be very honest with you. I didn't really think I was particularly suited to it. I thought I might be suited to writing it. And because I'd written this play, and because I was writing with Hugh, I kind of wanted to be on stage, because I'd done a lot of acting, and I wanted to be on stage with Hugh and Emma, but I thought Hugh and Emma were just way above me in terms of comic performance, and I wasn't sure what my range was. Hugh was funny in every way. He was funny physically, had a funny face. He could play, no, in a good way. He could goggle those blue eyes and just make one laugh. He could do those rather peculiar things, which have technical names like slow burns and double takes, which are particular ways of looking and, that sort of goggling thing. And I felt very self-conscious if I tried to do that. But when we started to write together, we write stuff for ourselves to perform. So it naturally fell out that the kinds of things we were writing would just fitted me like a glove. And I just grew more and more confident as we rehearsed and as we did it. And I naturally tended to take the role of the more pompous, the more bossy, the figure in charge, and Hugh, the slightly more forlorn, hopeless character. Like so many things, comedy, perhaps more straight away, is about confidence. If you don't think you're going to be amusing, the audience kind of knows it somehow. And even if you're saying lines that are funny, there's a strain and a tension and an embarrassment and a sweatiness that is just agony for both parties. And everybody starts that way, usually, unless you have the good fortune to write your own material, and especially if it's fictional material. If I'd started in 10 years later, when sketch comedy was almost illegal and had to be a stand-up, I don't know how I'd do it. I don't know how they get their courage, how they develop this relationship with an audience, and it's usually they've got gonged off, and it's difficult.
But you said earlier you were born to write, but I think all of us who've been watching you, it looks like you were born to perform. I mean, you seem so comfortable in the way, it's been said of Barry Humphrey said of himself that he stands on a stage and all of a sudden he relaxes because he says to himself, alone at last.
Yes.
It's where he belongs.
I do feel that. I used to go as a child into Norwich with my parents and my brother, who's 18 months older than me. We used to go and see the Christmas pantomime, the Panto. And, if it was Cinderella, there's usually the young comedian figure who comes on who's playing buttons. Anyway, at the Panto, the buttons will come on and say, now, are there any boys and girls who'd like to join me up on stage? I was up there, straight away, stretching my hand so much the membrane of my underarm would split. I was just absolutely desperate. And at exactly the same time, my brother had sunk so far below the seat that he was completely invisible. We had the same parents, we had largely the same DNA, except for tiny differences, obviously. We were brothers, and yet why was it that the moment I saw someone performing on a stage, that was the side I wanted to be. And my brother, like most normal, healthy people, wanted to be in the audience, thank heavens. Though maybe in the modern world of blogging and videos and uploading and user-generated content, maybe more and more people are going to get the bug to perform rather than watch. And
I wonder also, is that one of Wilde's observations, that man is least himself when he talks in his own person? Give him a mask and he will tell you the truth.
Yes, I mean, it's a profound observation, and like most of Wilde's observations, it takes a great deal of thought to unpick. At first, it just sounds like a clever, reversal, a chiasmus, as an orator would say, you swap it, like, so his famous epigrams are quite obvious reversals, like, work is the curse of the drinking classes, for example. And it's great because it really works as a, and it's funny and it makes you laugh and so on. But I do think it's true that you can express yourself best. As writers who write both types say, they tend to write fiction when they want to tell the truth. And they tend to write non-fiction when they want to tell a story. And it sounds clever, but it's absolutely true that facts get in the way of truth. Truth is something more fundamental than simple facts. And people get, sidetracked by a fact, but the truth of a thing is something much more profound and much more exciting. And fiction tells it better, and performance tells truth. So maybe we are all rather tragic figures of the natural performers, because we only really exist when we're in a space like this. When this finishes and I go off stage, I will trail forlornly in a melancholy state to my dressing room, and I will sit in a lonely fashion, and as has happened twice, what are the odds against this? I will accidentally spill the contents of a bottle of vodka down my throat, and then I'll just, be carried by the concierge of the hotel, vomiting over his shoulder, laid into bed, and wake up miserable and lonely until the clock tells me it's time to do the second one of these performances.
And you will wake up and animate. Don't. But they were incredibly fertile and active years for you, those years after sort of the footlights break through, when you came to Australia and discovered wine and Grange Hermitage for $1 a bottle. Yes. Radio, film, writing, theatre. You, in 1995, quite famously walked off the stage. You ran to, of all places, Belgium. You considered suicide, and you were diagnosed with bipolar disorder or manic depression. What I'm so interested in is you went on and made a documentary about that, where you talked about, and other people talked about, even though you wanted to be well, even though this was crippling your life in some way, there was something about the creativity of that disorder.
Yes, I mean, bipolar disorder, I call this film The Secret Life of a Manic Depressive, and one has to be very, very straightforward about this. Manic depression, bipolar disorder is a very morbid condition. And the doctors here, they will be the first to say, this is not something to take lightly. It's something to be diagnosed. It's something, that it does cause. When I say morbid, I mean in the medical sense. It causes death, and it causes deeply unhealthy lifestyles, and deep unhappiness for the person inflicted, and really hugely for their families and those who love them. And the way I'm often, because I've made this film, asked by people who are in terrible straits of unhappiness, or they love someone who is in terrible unhappiness. They ask how to deal with it. If I could answer that, gosh, how happy that would make me. The closest I can come is to say that the mood is your own personal weather, and it's very like the weather. If you go outside and it's raining, it's not you that's made it rain. It has rained, and it is real. You can't unthink the rain. You can't say, I'll walk it off and then it'll be sunny. The weather makes up its own mind. And the two mistakes are either to deny that it's raining when it clearly is. It's raining. Let's face it. And the other thing is to say, therefore my life is over. It's raining, the sun will now never come out. That's it. Because we all know, in terms of the weather, that it can be a damn nuisance when it's raining, but that the sun will come out. And it's the same if you're a manic depressive. You have a manic episode, you have a depressive. When you're depressed and you think you cannot conceive of such a thing as the future, life is so black you cannot imagine a tomorrow. Everything is just awful. Your energy is slow and there's nothing possible in life. It's terrible. It's actually painful. It's bad, really bad. It can be, for some people, so bad that they really have to end their lives in some way. They feel it anyway. But the fact is, it will come out. And in the case of a bipolar person, it won't just be normal, it'll then go super normal. It will become incredibly sunny. And rather than having no sense of the future, you plan for 100 futures. You are so excited with the possibility of what you can do in this world, with your creative power, with your entrepreneurial ideas. Your grandiosity knows no bounds. It's an extraordinary feeling. Terrible for people around you. But you know, I asked everybody I spoke to if there was a button and they could press the button, and they would no longer be, you know, manic depressives, they would no longer have this bipolar disorder, would they press the button? And only about 2 said yes, because that manic state is a thing to be treasured sometimes. I mean...
And is that true for you?
Yes, it is. I'm very lucky. I have really what they call cyclothymia. It's in America they call it bipolar light. It is a more manageable version. But it does have its bad moments. But you know, I spoke to people who had taken electric drills to their brain to kill themselves. I spoke to a man who was really extraordinary, called Rod Harvey. He had been a commander in the Royal Navy. He'd actually had a position on the Royal Yacht Britannia, as it happens, with which the Queen and the royal family used to have as their yacht. And he was a charming and splendid, promising officer, and he developed this condition. It became very, very bad. He had to leave the Navy, then he couldn't hold down a job. At one point, he was in a hospital being looked after, and his depression was so black, he got up, was supposed to have some security, but he short-circuited it, and he walked in front of a lorry, and he smashed both his legs. Now, he's the first to say, how could I do that to the lorry driver? For one thing, it's terrible. And he showed me his legs, that he can walk. They slowly, with the number of times they had to re-break them, set in metal. I said, the agony of both your legs, you could see the scars on it. He said, yes, but do you want to know something? It was nothing like as terrible as the pain that made me stand in front of that lorry. And that's the thing you have to understand with that kind of depression. It is not just, oh, snap out of it. You know, things will get better. Look on the bright side. It is an illness. It is a real physical descent of something quite terrible into people's minds. And if you say to someone, I'm asthmatic or I'm diabetic, they don't go, oh yeah, oh goodness. But if you say I'm bipolar, there is a little look that can flicker in their eyes, and it's tricky. Not in Hollywood, of course. I interviewed my good friend Carrie Fisher, who you may remember as Princess Leia,
yes.
The daughter of Debbie Reynolds, wonderful, amazing person. And she describes herself as the poster child for full bipolar. It is sort of ironic because she's had a very tough and extraordinary life, as you'll know if you've seen or read Postcards from the Edge. But she said, Stephen, you've got it all. I said, what do you mean? She said, gay, Jewish, and bipolar. How can you fail in Hollywood?
Congratulations.
Thank you.
I wonder if it was something, I think you said once that you could never live in suburbia because the sound of sprinklers brings you out in a hive.
Yes. Well, it's a kind of shorthand for me, sprinklers, or, you know, I'm lucky to think, essentially, I've never in my life, since I was a child when my father made me, I've never had to handle a lawnmower. And a lawnmower to me is a symbol of something. And maybe Oscar Wilde is a good place to go here, because when I first became sort of well-known, I used to go to, universities would ask me to give a talk here or do a debate there or something or other, talk to a media studies, the way that they might. And occasionally you get asked, if you were staying in the university town, you get asked to, have a drink in people's rooms and so on. I don't mean anything salacious here. And when I was a student, and right up through the early 80s maybe, you would see the standard student posters. You'd see Che Guevara, Jimi Hendrix, John Lennon maybe, posters of them, because revolutionary politics and rock and roll were going to change the world. But as the 80s turned into the 90s, I noticed that these posters were replaced by principally 2 other people, partly because the death of Lennon, the stifling kind of ossification of pop music, the commercialization of it, the further commercialization of it, and the falling of the Berlin Wall, the clear betrayal that communism had made of any hope to be thought of as the friend of the working classes and the liberator of the oppressed. Actually, I started to see more and more posters of Albert Einstein and Oscar Wilde. And it's as if the student generation realized that freedom and the future lay in the mind. Wilde said, if you want to be a grocer or a general or a politician or a judge, you will invariably become it. That is your punishment. If you never know what you want to be, if you live what some might call the dynamic life, but I will call the artistic life, if each day you are unsure of who you are and what you know, you will never become anything, and that is your reward.
We, before you arrived in Australia yesterday, contacted some members of the Twitterverse.
Oh, Lordy.
And we invited them to send in some questions. Okay. 2 internet questions, because the first, which I just thought was very funny, from Steph Claire Noir. Would you like a Tim Tam? Do you have an answer?
If someone can explain to me what a Tim Tam is, I'm almost...
Well, you show
Is
up.
it like a violet crumble?
It's like Milo in a biscuit.
Oh, I'm so ashamed. of not
Another.
knowing. But I have had a violet crumble, if that's any use.
That's very good. We are running very short of time, but you, I believe, are the last surviving man who knows the answer to why 42. Douglas Adams' explanation for the life, the universe, and everything. So what is it? Share.
It's really wonderful. The last time, it's almost as if my dear, darling friend Douglas, who died so sadly early, he was an extraordinary and a wonderful man, and I could devote an evening just to talking about Douglas, but it's almost sometimes, I think, as if he's in the room when I talk about this answer to 42, which he did vouchsafe me, because the last time I announced the reason for it, the microphone went dead. And if it was to happen again, we would be in real trouble. But the simple reason why 42 is that that simple. Yeah.
Final Twitter question, which comes from Warp975.
Right.
Will you accept the role, Stephen Fry, of our Lord and Master?
Oh, very well.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks, Stephen Fry.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, Rebecca, thank you so much. Thank you. You're very lovely. Thank you so much. Oh, bless you. Much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. What's that? Is that for me? Wow, thanks.
You can pre-order the DVD of Stephen Fry live at the Sydney Opera House at ABC shops or online. Next week, the famous Belgian detective returns as David Suchet stars in Poirot, next Sunday night on ABC One.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.